They were having a party. Prosperity.
Then there came a time when the market was so saturated and housing prices were so high that people just can't afford them anymore.
It ended because there wasn't anybody else to sell a house to. This was it. There was nobody left.
That last new borrower into housing, he was already in by the end of '04.
Hey! Hey, buddy! You want to buy a house?
The entirety of the mortgage industry was running by 2005 on refinancing.
Toward the end of 2006, it stopped becoming possible to refinance the home. And as soon as that happened, then the defaults began.
You started to see people take out a mortgage and not even make the first payment.
Once that process starts of defaults, it sets off a chain reaction throughout the banking system.
Foreclosure is catching. As each loan defaults, the value of the other houses in the neighborhood drops. And then those loans are in trouble.
The banks realized that if they kept providing those loans, they were going to keep having worse and worse loans in their portfolios, and they wouldn't be able to securitize them, which meant they were going to get stuck on their balance sheets. So we saw a scramble in late '06 and early '07 by the banks to shut down those lines of business, which really was the kickoff of the end.
By the time we get to 2007, 2008, in the financial crisis, the liquidity problems that were affecting banks and particularly non-bank mortgage companies are starting to attack even these government-guaranteed entities, Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac.
Freddie and Fannie were claiming they had no subprime mortgages. It turns out they had $2 trillion in subprime mortgages. They were claiming their subprime mortgages weren't subprime mortgages, but when we actually looked at them objectively after the fact, they turned out to be.
They had no one who actually looked at the mortgages. They had no one who worked in real estate on the ground, understanding who was buying these houses.
And that's what misled people. It wasn't fraud. People were buying AAA bonds that turned out to be Fs.
You couldn't have rated these things well if you knew what the actual state of the mortgages were, unless you were just a complete liar.
If there was anybody who was going to be paying attention to all of this, it should have been the Federal Reserve, maybe the Treasury, but for sure the Federal Reserve, and they weren't.
One of the myths of the subprime crisis is that people were buying derivative contracts that they did not understand. We need to keep in mind that a lot of these derivative contracts are held by quite sophisticated investment banks and quite sophisticated commercial banks.
They were largely high-risk investors. They were taking enormous risks. They knew it. These are very sophisticated people in these bonds. And then they got creamed when the bonds went bad. That was absolutely justice. That's the way markets work. They were not victims. They've justice done.
Now, the logic of the investment bank is, look, we're not saying these things are good. In fact, a lot of the investment banks were shorting the various the very products that they were selling to someone else. But their logic is, we sold them to insurance companies and whatever. And, you know, they're sophisticated investors.
But we're not talking about you and I walking off the street. We're talking about major investment banks. These people aren't stupid. They knew what was going on.
Mom and pops didn't buy these bonds. You probably never even heard of them, right? This shadow banking system was Goldman Sachs selling bonds to the Harbin Endowment, who's run by a bunch of PhDs that are all, quote, geniuses, that were taking wild risks and got creamed. That's life, right? Good riddance. That's why they should have let the market clear, let these guys fail, and go on. Instead, they put a lot of home builders out of business, which are usually mom and pop businesses run by a guy out of his backyard. They put all those guys out of business, and they saved Goldman Sachs, and that's crazy.
Well, we all know what happens next. Suddenly, as in who could have predicted it, people realize what was bought, sold, traded, insured, tranched, swapped, and sold again isn't actually there, which leaves a lot of people holding some very toxic bags.
When Freddie and Fannie failed, they owed $5 trillion, and they had $2 trillion, and $1 trillion is a big number, in subprime mortgages.
Money market mutual funds were leveraged 100%. They had no net worth. That's a huge mistake. Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, on their balance sheet, they were leveraged 25 to 1. If you included the guarantees that they had issued on the mortgage-backed securities, their leverage was 75 to 1. A standard commercial bank would be leveraged merely 12.5 to 1. The holding company of Citicorp, $900 billion of assets, no net worth at the holding company. Essentially, they were leveraged 100% as well. No net worth. And finally, the 5 large investment banks, Goldman, Morgan Stanley, and Merrill Lynch, had each $1 trillion in assets. Lehman had almost $700 billion in assets, and Bear Stearns had $400 billion in assets.
Only 20 financial institutions basically caused this crisis. 10 of them were S&Ls. The biggest ones were Countrywide and Washington Mutual, and there was a bunch of smaller ones. The S&Ls originated these subprime mortgages, and then the investment banks, the large investment banks that are well known, distributed these subprime mortgages. No mainstream commercial bank had anything to do with either the origination or securitization of subprime mortgages.
So, trillion, 700 billion, 400 billion, and they are leveraged 33 to 1.
The politicians who were facing the crisis in 2008 were basically scared into bailing everyone out.
So Hank Paulson or Geithner or Larry Summers comes walking into the Oval Office and says, we got a problem, this is a storm, this is unlike anything we've ever seen. We've got to give these guys money to get them out of it, otherwise it's all going to collapse. And the president naturally says, well, so what? It's just another industry. What happens if it collapses?
Why is it that a bank can be too big to fail, but a manufacturing company isn't too big to fail?
No, you don't understand. Their counterparties are at insurance firms, and they're at consumer firms, and they're at banks overseas, and this is going to cause an international calamity. It's really a scare tactic, but it works because you don't know what's on the other end of that rainbow. And if you're Obama or Bush or whoever else, you don't want to find out.
You know, if you're head of the Federal Reserve and you're head of the Treasury, and if you're even a politician, you don't want to look bad, right? You don't want to look bad with all this bad stuff going on in the economy. So it was really the politicians panicking, not the markets panicking.
Every single thing that will get you unelected will happen unless you give these guys money.
You particularly had Treasury Secretary Hank Paulson making a number of statements during that period that scared the hell out of people. He got up on TV and started talking about how the government had to buy bad assets from Citigroup. He was basically telling everyone that the bank was insolvent.
We are facing financial Armageddon. If we don't pass this TARP legislation this week, without debate, without hearings, pass it now, there may not be a financial system left next week.
And this scared the hell out of people.
It inspires zero confidence. It panics people, and that's exactly what happened.
Hank Paulson almost destroyed the world, and yet he's lionized for addressing the financial crisis. It's quite amazing.
And what created so much commotion in the market wasn't the correction. It was the unbelievable ambiguity and lack of rule of law, where the regulators were arbitrarily making decisions that you could not rationally justify, and nobody knew what the decisions were. The panic was all caused by how it was handled.
It was clear within minutes of Lehman Brothers' failure that this was probably not a good idea. The financial industry was expecting the government to stand behind these firms.
How can you bail out Bear Stearns and then let Lehman go into bankruptcy? What are the rules here?
Paulson hated Lehman, and it was well known in the marketplace. The market perception, fair or unfair, was that Paulson let Lehman go because he just didn't like him. So the rule of law was gone. Lehman's a much bigger market player, much bigger issue than Bear Stearns. I mean, the only reason you would do it would be some emotional reason.
Markets can't stand that kind of uncertainty. And There was no rationale for what they were doing and why they were doing it. And then AIG comes along, and they give AIG an $80 billion bailout. They basically nationalized the company.
You know, Citigroup's the most political bank in the United States. Geithner was there at Treasury for one purpose, which was to make sure that his political mentor, Bob Rubin, didn't get annihilated by having that bank fail.
Geithner, he didn't want to be embarrassed if Citigroup failed. So he kept Citigroup in business effectively, while Covey didn't have that political clout, so they got to fail.
They've been telling us for months on end that Fannie and Freddie were in great shape. They didn't need any help. And then all of a sudden, boom, on one weekend, they basically failed the institutions by nationalizing them.
At the end of the day, you have to believe that politics plays a role in who gets bailed out or not.
Were you lying when you said that those institutions didn't need help? Or are you lying today?